So in this video, we're going to respond to some of the Reddit comments on our CosmeRNA and the video I made. This following comment is from the user JustCattle1271, and I'll just let the text-to-speech read his comment.
I must point out that you are telling a subtle lie or making a huge mistake, and I think your prejudices and criticism about CosmeRNA from a perverse point of view originated from the following misunderstandings. At the end of the video, you said, the product was denied approval by the Korean Food and Drug Safety Administration due to safety concerns. As a result, Bioneer opted to market the CosmeRNA as cosmetic rather than a drug in the European market. However, this is totally wrong and your misunderstanding probably due to ignorance of behind stories at that time between Bioneer and the Korean FDA, KFDA. Originally Bioneer had planned to sell the CosmeRNA as cosmetic, not a drug, in the Korean market. I will not tell details of the story about KFDA's disapproval at this moment, but after being disapproved by KDFA, Bioneer decided to apply to EU authorities as cosmetic because EU was the second market and US was the third originally. The lawsuit case between KFDA and Bioneer is still being held. Therefore, Bioneer had nothing to hide or exaggerate to EU authorities. Bioneer submitted the same clinical data and papers to the European authorities as those submitted to the Korean FDA. Perhaps some supplementary material could have been added. However, the screening results in Europe were completely different from those in Korea. It was approved by both EU and UK as Bioneer targeted for. You should not mislead the people to think Bioneer opted to market the CosmeRNA as cosmetic rather than a drug in the European in order to avoid EU's safety requirements for a drug. Remember, marketing CosmeRNA as cosmetics in Europe was Bioneer's original plan, even before applying to the Korean FDA. CosmeRNA was successfully passed through all procedures as cosmetic and finally approved by EU authorities. As far as I know, Bioneer's next plan is apply it to US FDA as a drug instead of a cosmetic. I have more things to debate your insists, but we'll probably consider them next time.
Okay, now that BS is out of the way, the key point in our discussion seems to be Bioneer's original plan of marketing CosmeRNA as a cosmetic, not a drug, in both Korea and the EU. Now, I did say in my video that they opted to sell CosmeRNA as a cosmetic in the EU after the South Korean FDA rejected CosmeRNA's attempt to sell this thing as a cosmetic, primarily due to the fact that it was using RNA technology. Now, I say opted because, from my understanding how it was portrayed through some of the articles that I looked at, it was loosely translated from Korean to English, and that was the impression that I got. So I'll be charitable and say that, from the get-go, Bioneer was attempting to have CosmeRNA be a cosmetic rather than a drug. It's a significant distinction because the safety standard and testing requirements for a cosmetic product differ vastly from those of a drug. This is especially important considering the technology employed in CosmeRNA, the use of RNA, which is typically associated with drug treatments, is kind of new, and it's even scantily used in drug treatments in general. So this is the reason why the Korean FDA, the South Korean FDA, might I correct myself, rejected CosmeRNA by Bioneer. Reddit user JustCattle1271, your assertion that Bioneer's decision to pursue approval in the EU after the rejection of the Korean FDA, South Korean FDA, was simply a continuation of the original plan doesn't eliminate the safety concerns that led to the disapproval. The fact remains that the Korean FDA denied approval due to safety concerns. This decision was made despite Bioneer's insistence on the safety and efficacy of CosmeRNA. Such discrepancy is indeed intriguing and warrants critical scrutiny. Finally, Bioneer's attempt to litigate the Korean FDA's decision does not necessarily vindicate them of their product. Rather, it kind of signals a disagreement on safety standards and testing requirements between the company and the regulatory authority. Given the potential health implications, siding with caution, as the Korean FDA has done, seems to be a prudent course of action. And while it's understandable that the EU's cosmetic regulation focuses primarily on skin safety due to the direct nature of the application, it does raise concerns when we're dealing with products that utilize more complex and potentially systemic technologies such as RNA. Given that CosmeRNA uses short interference RNA, siRNA technology, which is typically associated with drug treatments, it seems reasonable to expect more stringent safety checks, as you have pointed out. Skin tests alone may not fully capture the potential systemic effects, especially considering that the product is meant to influence hair growth, which necessitates action of the hair follicle level. The fact that Bioneer only performed skin compatibility tests, as indicated in their email correspondence shown in my last video, indeed falls short of what one might expect for a product of this nature. A scalp biopsy test could prove a more accurate picture of CosmeRNA's action at the hair follicle level, as well as systemic tests to show it does not enter the blood to any significant extent. This situation reveals the need for stricter oversight from the regulatory agencies like the EU's cosmetic regulatory body, particularly when it comes to products that straddle the line between cosmetics and drugs. Cosmetics utilizing advanced biotechnologies such as RNA should perhaps be held to a higher standard of safety testing due to their potential for systemic effects. Furthermore, it's worth noting that transparency and thoroughness in testing are key to building trust with consumers and the broader public. While Bioneer is bound by regulatory standards set by the EU for cosmetics, as well as the Korean FDA for cosmetics and drugs, as a company, it also has the responsibility to its consumers to ensure the utmost safety of its products, and also letting them know how safe those products are by allowing their studies to be published publicly. To my understanding, there's a second study that they conducted, and in the email correspondence, as seen in my last video with Dermatest, they're not going to release their findings in that particular study because Bioneer has Dermatest under an NDA, so Bioneer wants to keep this on the low. In short, it's a PR nightmare for Bioneer not being able to be transparent and directly show their consumers how safe their product is and how efficacious it is as well. It's vital for companies like Bioneer to go beyond the minimum regulatory requirements and adopt a more comprehensive testing approach. But why do that when you have to save money, right? So while I acknowledge your point about Bioneer's original marketing plan for CosmeRNA, the safety concerns, inconsistencies in their decision-making process, and the change in their product's classification are all valid points that need to be addressed. And also the other points about terminal hair count, you didn't seem to look into that, but we'll touch on that more lately. These points do not necessarily make Bioneer's claims deceptive, but they do raise valid questions that consumers and potential investors should consider. It does look shady, let's be honest. Also, it's funny how this guy is trying to make me seem like I'm a short seller or something. Look, have a look at my older video, quote, overview of androgenetic alopecia treatments, most of what you need to know, end quote. I actually at one point was looking into using CosmeRNA, and I was hopeful about the product. I even recommended it. And upon closer inspection, I personally found it to be a sham. So no, I'm not hired by any other company. I'm not a short seller. I'm just a genuine person who's expressing a concern, backing that concern up with the evidence that I have been able to gather and also my subscribers have been able to gather, and this is me presenting that to the public. Also, this dude is on Reddit attempting to gaslight consumers about CosmeRNA being sold in South Korea. As this other user on Reddit points out against user JustCattle1271, CosmeRNA cannot be sold in South Korea. However, it can be sold internationally, and because it is sold internationally, there are people in South Korea who are purchasing CosmeRNA by international means. It's not because it's being sold directly to them by some CosmeRNA depot in South Korea. That's not the case. It's not being sold in South Korean stores. So let's make this as clear as possible. And now up next we have this other user, Itchy Jackfruit 8337. I'll just call him Itchy Jackfruit. And I'm not going to put his comments through that text-to-speech vocoder or whatever. Instead, I'll just leave them here as screenshots. This user, Itchy Jackfruit, is attempting to say that he debunked me because total hair counts, which include both terminal and vellus hairs, are a valid endpoint and assessment of efficacy, and CosmeRNA didn't do anything wrong. He points out how some of the studies that CosmeRNA cited, which concerned finasteride, relied on total hair counts. But this is watering down the point. CosmeRNA is muddying the waters here, because even if we have some finasteride studies that show an increase in total hair count, with them not mentioning terminal hairs exclusively, this does not mean that CosmeRNA is just as effective as a treatment. And this does not mean that finasteride only improves total hair count, and for that reason we can distinguish, is finasteride more effective in improving terminal hairs than vellus hairs? Because the reality is, finasteride is effective primarily because it improves terminal anagen hairs. That's why visual improvements and maintenance is much more obvious in finasteride users. It is the growth of terminal hairs that makes it more efficacious. Now, CosmeRNA may very well be growing hairs in general. However, that does not mean that it is the desired terminal hairs which contributes to density. Again, what good are hairs if they are vellus? Vellus hairs don't contribute to density on your scalp. They barely do, and they don't reduce the visual state of hair loss. Vellus hairs are short, little thin, wispy, small hairs that you can't do shit with. Like, let's just be as blunt as possible. You can't do shit with the vellus hair. Now, it would be nice to see that those vellus hairs eventually turn terminal, but we didn't see that in the first CosmeRNA study, and the second study hasn't even been released, and I don't think it's going to be released. And I want to make clear that they did cite a study from India where the Indian researchers found that finasteride increased terminal hair count. They used terminal hair count because it is terminal hairs that we see. It is terminal hairs that is important to covering the scalp, to reducing the appearance of balding. So Itchy Jackfruit then says Bioneer referenced that study, but it doesn't seem to fit in their paper because they didn't need to rely on it to support their total hair count assessment. But that's not how this works, buddy. Because that doesn't alleviate Bioneer from creating a product that actually makes visual changes in hair shaft dynamics, density, and terminal hair count. Plus, Katie Kaufman, a researcher in one of the papers that Bioneer cited in a finasteride review, actually talks about how terminal hair counts is the primary reason why finasteride is efficacious. And many studies that look at this look into terminal hair counts. So it's not me just, you're using terminal hair counts as a way to win the argument. Terminal hair counts, that is the argument. So anyway, that's it for this video. It's a bit semi-longish, and it's a way just to respond to these people. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Don't fall for shareholders and how they may try to manipulate you. And again, I'm all for waiting to see people's progress on CosmeRNA. Now, my main concern is that people aren't solo running CosmeRNA, so they may be using other things in their hair loss stack that's more efficacious, so to speak. Also, I just want to say that there is this weird take that some of these people have in support of CosmeRNA. They're like, listen, even after everything you've just said and pointed out, why don't you just try it out yourself to see if it really does work? Why don't you just spend 300 whatever to see if it works? 300 euros, 300 pounds, $300. And to me, that's so asinine. Why would anyone have to, with absence of efficacy, mind you, why would anyone have to pay that much money to see if something works when the studies on this particular product look very shaky? That's just a stupid way of you trying to get me to pay for a product that, mind you, may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, I've already given my money to that company? People have to be more cautious. And some people are going to be like, it's just 300 euros or pounds or dollars. I'm a big baller. I have a lot of money. It doesn't matter to me. That's not the point, right? I, and probably many other people, aren't just going to shell out money to a company that hasn't really proven itself in this particular field. That's crazy.